Hi everyone, this is really cool. I'm so stoked to be here. 5 years since I came to my first React Conf, and this is my first time seeing it from this side. Honestly, I could not be more excited to share this story with you. So thanks for the intro, Devin. I'm Jed. You might know me from the internet as Jed Watson. And I work for, or actually co-founded, a consultancy in Sydney called ThinkMill. At ThinkMill, we make software. But this story isn't about that. This story is about something that I made called React Select. Now, it was actually almost 5 years ago to the day that I published the first version of React Select to NPM. I had no idea what I was in for. I starred it myself. That was really cute. That's that 1 star there. And over the next year, it matured. I added a lot of stuff to it. I got 1.0 beta out. That's okay, React was still on a 0. Release at this point, so it was very cool to be in beta. Started picking up some stars. Another year, RC, because what comes after beta, the RC. Stars went up, that was pretty crazy. And then another year after that, 1.0 was released. And everything's kind of tracking along nicely, but you'll hear more about that in a minute. I just want to give you the timeline of the whole project. So a year later, we actually released version 2, which was a huge rewrite. And this is where I've started tracking downloads. And as at today, this got big. Wow. That's a scary amount of downloads per week, honestly. Also, this is a really long time. This is 5 years of my life in like one component. I've changed a lot in the last 5 years. It's also changed a lot in the last 5 years. Anyway, this is a story that I wanted to come here and tell you today. So it's a story about a Select component and my experience as an open source maintainer and how that worked out. So there was a really great talk earlier today, and this one line stuck with me. I created a terrible first draft. And I was like, yeah, I sure did. And then another, and then another. But it is kind of a masterpiece. And just to put that in context, I don't know how this happened. React DOM gets 5.5 million downloads a week. That makes sense to me. Class name still gets a lot. Redux and React Router, I'm like, yeah, they're huge. But React Select actually gets 30% of the downloads of React DOM, which means that for every person or every 3 people using React on the web, or I guess if you're counting by downloads, someone's using React Select. Why? It's crazy, right? It's just a Select component. So it's actually got quite a lot of features. I set out from the start to build a whole lot of stuff because I needed them for a couple of projects I was working on. There are things like search as you type, single and multi-select focus management, menu layering and positioning, being able to pull in menu items asynchronously from an API, also a huge focus on accessibility and touch support, keyboard, and being able to create new items if they didn't exist. And it wasn't just about the features. I had some design goals for the project as well that I think might have helped it in the early days. So the design goals that I had were that it had to be powerful. I wanted to make a proper declarative React API for it. I didn't want it to be too opinionated. I had this idea you should just be able to use it in all these different scenarios, and just because you're using it, if people are putting this in their apps, then they need to be able to own the data. They need to own the way it's working. They need to be able to control it. It should also perform really well. And finally, despite the power and the flexibility, I wanted it to just work. Out of the box, right? You install this thing from NPM, you put it on the page, and it just works. Big goal. So I got to it. And I've got to say, React made it really, really hard. There's all this crazy imperative logic that you need to abstract, like focus management. You click on the control, and the focus needs to move to an input, but the control's already focused. It bent my head for about a week, actually, the first time. Debouncing updates, but it was like a deep dive into the life cycle of React, and eventually React was right, and I learned, and it started working. I got it to work, and it was like this, wow, I know how to do this now. It was amazing. So that was really quite a cool experience building it for the first time. I used, for the nostalgic amongst you in the audience, React 0.12, _ class names less gulp and browserify. This was my toolchain of choice, just to age— but I put it on the internet, and it was a blast. By the time I was done, I had about 50 props, all this internal state, intricate logic. I was really proud of it. It worked. And I learned about the first phase of open source, which is joy, excitement, and stars. It's really exciting. You put something out there, people like it, they start using it, you get happy. You feel like this. Also, side effect of publishing stuff on open source is that people open issues and PRs, so you actually get to learn a lot. You get to integrate a lot of new knowledge into your project. And I did that. I also made some really good friends along the way. So early contributors, people like Brian reached out and started helping me. And it's been really good. Quite a few of the people who worked with me on this project are friends, like some of them are in the room today. But honestly, things got a bit out of hand. And all that intricate logic that I mentioned, yeah, that led to a lot of core complexity. And, you know, this is kind of understandable for a first draft. Whoa, that's too many slides. All right, so now React is meant to be really good at this. As things become complex, you can break them down into components and compose them back together again. React's really good at helping you with this. In fact, there's a whole page about it called Thinking in React. Now, this is my favorite page on the React docs. Now, this is like, if you could read one page on those docs, sorry, Dan, it would be this one for me. And it's got this great diagram of how to think about breaking up a UI into smaller components. But what if you can't actually break down a component any further? All right? The challenge with a select is that they're really complex and sophisticated, but you can't actually break them down into any smaller primitive. The way they manage options and values, they sort of behave like a single input. And the way they manage focus and accessibility, like it's all kind of got to be tangled together. They need to be controlled by a single brain. And you can probably see where I'm going with this. Because every new use case required more complexity to be added into the core component. And the thing is, like, everyone who has a different use case for a component like this only really needs to customize about 5%. But every person needs to customize a different 5%. So your surface area of like what can be customized becomes a significant amount of the component. And because of that, issues and PRs mounted. Edge cases coming in conflicted with other edge cases, and also life happens. This is my favorite slide. This is me, my wife, and our daughter. Thank you. This is a really happy slide for me. Honestly, like if I could get away with it, the rest of my talk would just be photos of my daughter, right? Because like that's all I want to think about, and that is what happened to React Select. This is kind of where the wheels fell off, right? Between the complexity of maintaining it and trying to integrate all these different use cases and fix bugs, and just having less time. Ooh. You know, I had a life and a job and a new child, and React Select was actually none of those. And it suffered for it. And so I learned about the second phase of open source, which is maintainers' anxiety and loss of sleep, having hundreds of open issues and PRs, and a lot of community frustration, because on the other side of each of those issues and PRs is a human who's put their time into either using your software or contributing to it. And you're not talking to them. You're just ignoring them, and that feels terrible. It really does. But I had a lot of time to kind of reflect on this and learn from what went wrong. And the way that I'd set up the project, it was hard for anyone else to step up and understand and maintain the complexity that existed. And also just like the way I architected the component. I spent a lot of time thinking about the way I'd architected the component. And I started realizing that actually, the only way out is through. I have to architect myself out of this mess. And so I really wanted to do that. And luckily, about this time, ThinkMill started working with Atlassian on AtlasKit, which is their React design system. And if you've ever used Atlassian software like Jira, you'll know it's got a lot of selects. Like Jira is basically a glorified form interface, right? Full of selects, that's all it does. They have components for assigning users and filtering issues and changing statuses and selecting options and inserting emojis, and some are async and some are fixed, and like everything you can think of. everything that moderately looks like a select, Atlas Kit needed to build. So I was like, cool, how are we going to do this? And I had a look at the way that they'd done the selects in Atlas Kit by the time I sort of got involved and started working with them. And they had two. There was a single select and a multi-select that had stateless and stateful variants. And the problem with this was I looked at that and I was like, wow, these are just as complicated as mine is. And they've got all these features, but they've actually got more yet to implement than they already have implemented. And they're already this complex. Like, this doesn't scale. Not at all. But also I looked at the list of things to be done, and React Select had already implemented most of them. So I had some prior art to draw on. And we started thinking, wouldn't it be cool if we could figure out how to create a new select built on the maturity of a 2.5-year-old open source project that actually could scale and do everything that you needed to do? Or in other words, we started thinking not so much about how to build a component as how to build a framework inside a component. So that version 2 rewrite that I mentioned that came in about halfway through the lifetime of the project, this was it. And what I did, instead of looking at other components and other React code to figure out how to address this, I looked at other significantly successful open source projects. I took inspiration from things like ESLint or Babel, which set themselves up as frameworks and then offload all the complexity of the different use cases into userland. You've got all of these plugins that just hook into the core APIs, and I thought, how could you apply that principle to a component? Because those projects, they're sustainable. They get maintained. That works really well for them. Can I do this? How do we do that in a React component? So I spent some time thinking about things that make up a component, and got down to 3. There's state, and there's functionality, and there's the user interface, which is the view and the styles that result from that. How do we change that? Well, we got one thing, props. That's our tool. How do we use React's props API to control these things and make them flexible? Let's start by having a look at state and functionality. What we can do is we can break these down into smaller independent parts and use this props API to allow them to be controlled by other components. Let's have a look at things you can do with props. Fundamentally, I think there are kind of 4 major categories. There are state or switches. There are events or callbacks that get fired by the component when that state should be updated. You can do extensions or functionality by passing functions into props, and of course there are children or render functions. So using these, let's see how we can simplify the component. Starting with state this time. React Select has 4 discrete buckets of state. This is much more obvious these days with hooks, but when I really looked at what was in my bucket of state, it was these 4 things. You've got the options for the menu, the current value of the component, the current value of the input inside the component, and finally whether or not the menu is open. So we kind of broke those down into 4 distinct things and made them controlled. Now, to that second type of prop, because these things need to change, we need some events. Let's add them in. Now we're expecting the state to be provided and just calling out to the event when they should change. And this simplified the core of the component considerably, because no longer did we have all this branching logic for controlled or uncontrolled within the component. Also, now my component can be smart or dumb in different ways. You can mix and match this stuff together. This is great, but I'm sure you can see the problem. If React Select isn't managing the state, that means the user has to now. And that broke the design goal of it just works. Enter the higher order component pattern. So I'm sure you've all seen this or used higher order components at this point, but this was actually a breakthrough in how to extrapolate sort of complexity out of the core component into other components. I'll show you a simple example of how this works, just to manage that value and on-change prop. So breaking this down, we have a new component that accepts value and on-change. We then track some internal state. We determine whether we want to be paying attention to the prop if it's provided or the internal state value. We create our own on-change, which is like a transparent kind of pass-through method, which will update the internal state but also call out to the prop if it was provided. And then we put those onto the component, spreading the rest of the props through. So we have this transparent state controller now that we can wrap around our select component. And to export it from the package and get back to it just works, it's as simple as this. We import the select and the manage state, and we wrap it, and we're done. That's a pretty simple thing to do. Let me show you how it gets more interesting. The asynchronous version originally was like a lot of the complexity of the core component, and we use the same pattern to do this as well. So get options returns a promise. We have some state. This time we're handling the on-input change, and we're spreading it all into the select. So this pattern is really powerful. And in terms of exporting it, it looks like this. That async component can be simple because it knows that it's going to get wrapped in something that's going to manage its state for it. And now we're good. Now let's look at another third category of things you can control with props, which are extensions and functionality. So we consolidated a lot of learnings from version 1 and really focused on how to use props in a way that made the component more powerful and consistent. Remember that goal, unopinionated? And like respect the sort of user, the sovereignty of the data that people are passing you through. I'll show you what that means. You have a select component, and it gets passed in options. It passes the same value to the on change, untouched. Select doesn't actually need to know anything about that because you can customize how the options are filtered, the way that they're selected. Right? We have same defaults, but we kind of allow the user to change as much or as little as they need to about that. I'll show you an example. If I've got these options, myself and Brian, and I wanted to use, instead of a label, a first name and a last name property, all I need to do is add a getOption label method to that to concatenate them together, and we're done. Or let's look at filtering. React Select has quite a powerful filtering library built into it. You can create variations on that and pass it in, but to get that to work with this new example, I just need to take the candidate and the input and like write my own function, and I'm done. So I've replaced as much of that API surface area as I needed to, but nothing that I didn't. Now, the final piece of the puzzle, if we're really empowering the user, is telling them more information about how stuff's changing. Declarative is quite limiting in the sense that we can't say, we can just say this is how it is, but we also need to provide information on why. So going back and having a look at events again in the context of supporting extensions, originally we just had this on change which would send you a value. We added meta into that to say why it changed. And that's also really powerful for extension authors because you now know, oh, this value was changed because the user added an option or removed an option or cleared the control, all that sort of thing. So that's the state and functionality out of the way. We'll just remove those values from our select. And let's have a look at things that make up a component. Again, circling back to the start, so the last piece is user interface. Now this is the thing that I'm most excited about. So one of the things I've always loved about React is this pitch. View is a function of state. This is really simple to get your head around, but I'm going to extend on it a little bit and say that it's not just the view, but also the styles are the function of state, because those two things together make up what you're seeing on the screen. And so shout out to Emotion and CSS and JS for really making this a reality in React Select. This is incredibly powerful if you're trying to build something that's extensible. So remember how I said a select is a really scary big component? It's still made up of identifiable UI components. And they look like this. You've got the container, the value label, a space for a loading indicator, a separator, a drop-down, a menu, a bunch of them. So we came up with an overrides pattern that lets you customize all of these. And what you can do is you can specify your own component or your own style function to apply to each of these different components that the select wants to render. And they're both the style function and the view component are provided the same state by the select itself. This is really powerful. So we'll take this example of myself and Brian again. And let's say that we wanted to take that value and link out from that value component to our Twitter. We can do that. We create a custom value component. We render that link. We pass the value component into the select. And hey presto, we're now links. And people can do this without changing the core anymore. Let's get a little bit crazy. Let's use a styling API and add a color in to each of us. So now we can create a value styles function. Again, it takes the same state, which for a value is the one that it's representing. We can change the background color, pass it through to React Select, and now we can be themed. And this sort of thing was never possible in version 1. This is actually a huge advance. But we can put it all together and do even more powerful things. I had this crazy idea. I was like, how far can I really take this? What if I do something just ridiculous? What if I try and create a date picker? Because that's the other category of really complex component in React. And what if I accidentally solved that as well? I did. It works. It's so crazy it works. This is the default set of options that are provided to the component. I hooked up the onInput change to a natural date language parser to pick a date. So when you start typing in next Monday, it actually picks next Monday for you. Or if you type in something like the 25th of August, it will go straight to the next 25th of August. And this is just like in userland. This is an example on the React Select website in about 100 lines. What's going on here is we're listening to that onInput change just like with an async select, but then we're running that through our natural language parser. We're picking the date we think it is, and we're generating dynamic options rather than loading them from a server. We're using a group to create this calendar type thing, and then we're using our custom styling API to make any of the dates inside of a group render like a calendar, and we're indenting the first one by the number of days. And that's all just using the APIs that I've shown you. Yeah, it's cool. So, like, this happened, and I knew I was onto something, because for very little effort, we got all of the same accessibility, keyboard touch support of our core select component, like, for free, out of the box. It's maybe not the best date picker in the world, but it's actually a really good one. And what I realized at the end of all this was, coming back to thinking in React, components aren't just for UI. They're for state and functionality as well. And it turns out we actually can break down a select into smaller components. And with this new customization API, most of these use cases didn't require changes to core anymore. And with that, I found the third phase of open source, which is, mostly sustainable. It's better. It's not perfect, but man, it's so much better. So this made a lot of difference. Anyway, some takeaways for you. The things that I learned through this journey. So some for React architecture. React's composition model, for me, has always been its secret weapon. This is why I got so kind of attracted to using it in the first place. Like, being able to turn things into components and compose them in a hierarchy, like, that's it. Everything else is just making that work. The reason why is it allows you to let complexity in and then break things down, compose them back together again, and repeat. And the secret to doing that successfully is paying attention to which component owns the state and just designing good props with that in mind. All of the bad things I've seen happen in React applications is when people haven't thought about which component should own the state or how that should be able to be controlled. I want to say it's that simple, but it's not. It's actually really hard, but it kind of ends up being that simple once you get your head around it. For any of those of you who work on design systems in the audience, this actually ended up being really influential on AtlasKit and other design systems that we build at ThinkMill. The whole pattern led to multiple different components composed on top of lower level primitive components. And when I say primitive, I don't really mean like simple. Obviously, the core select is not simple, but that composition pattern actually, you think about the ones you finally export as the artifacts of your design system, everything under that is part of the framework of your design system. And that helps them scale and be a lot more sustainable. A good way to think about how much to lean in on this that I've been sort of thinking about lately is this: where is the complexity? You can think of a bit of a spectrum of complexity from, is the complexity in the styles? Is it all there, like a button? There's 50 different ways of rendering it, but it doesn't have to do much. Or is it like a select, where really it's halfway in the middle, and then you're probably going to get real benefit out of thinking about that component as a framework? Or even something like a tooltip, where most of the complexity is just in positioning and rendering and timing and debouncing and things like that. Also for design systems, I just want to bring this slide back up again because I can't emphasize how much of a game changer this was, moving away from static style sheets where we had to predetermine the state to being able to use state dynamically. I know there's a lot of trade-offs and cost sort of benefit that you can look into in terms of how you're going to do CSS and JS or versus static. Also, choose your own library. But this was a real game changer for this kind of component. And final set of takeaways is for anyone involved in open source. As hopefully this helps explain, composition is king. People will find use cases that you have never imagined. That's the fun. Well, some of the fun. But how do you design an API that makes that possible? Once you've got that API, automate everything, or even beforehand, automate everything. This lets you maximize the time spent actually considering those issues and PRs and not the manual process. We came up with a whole lot of things for React Select, including a lot that we built ourselves to make it sustainable. We have Prettier and ESLint for code styles. We have this great tool I want to give a shout out to called Change Sets, which manages all of the changelog generation and release process. We have automated website deployment to Netlify and branch preview deploy, so when a PR comes in, I can actually test it and see it and play with it while I'm looking at the PR without cloning that branch locally. All of the examples have a button that will let you launch them in Code Sandbox automatically, which is great for getting people to submit issues with reproduction cases. We generate all of our documentation automatically from our types. There was a talk yesterday that demonstrated a similar thing, but we did that as well. And I would never have been able to document the surface area of this component without a tool like that and keep it in sync. And finally, tools like Cypress for automated testing are also invaluable. And the last one for any maintainers is to empower other maintainers. Getting other people to help me with this has been the best thing ever. I want to give shout-outs to Josh Mackerson, Dave Brotherstone, Brian Vaughan, Charles Lee, Mitchell Hamilton, and the Atlas Kit team for helping me with this, because without them, I would not have been able to do it. Find anyone, friends, family, pets. Maintainers are just your best friends in open source. As a little bonus for anyone who is using open source now, the other side of this whole puzzle, let me just share a couple of things with you from my perspective that I've learned over the years. The first one is stuff like this is really not actually as helpful as you think it is. No, let's not do this. Instead, this tells me nothing. Right? I've got this super complex component, and I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate some idea that you've got that you think you need into my abstract problem-solving brain. I don't want to know that you need something the way it's written or the way you think you need it. I just need to know what you're trying to do, because then maybe I'll understand that you need it, or maybe I'll realize that you need something else. So I'm trying to do X, and this would help me because Y is really the information that makes it so much easier to maintain these projects. Or even better, sometimes I get this one and I love it. Is there any way I can help? All right? Yeah. Thank you. If someone's not responding to you on GitHub, it doesn't mean they're not listening. It might just mean that they're actually really struggling to find the time to answer it in the format that it's been posed. That's a real thing. This was asked of me on Twitter just last week. Is it okay for someone new contributing to an open source project to comment or review a PR? And yeah, absolutely. That's actually really helpful, as long as it doesn't look like this. This is me. I did this. It just looks good, and submit review. Mitchell, you're a star. Thank you. Yeah, same thing, right? It's not actually helping me as a maintainer understand the code review that you've done. Tell me what edge cases you found. Tell me why the change is safe. Help me understand it without spending the time sinking into the code myself as deeply without any context. That's a super useful thing as well. And finally, just be nice to each other. I've had so many people get angry with me on GitHub that I've never met. I've had people treat me like shit. It's really weird. I'm nice. I try and be nice. Just be nice to each other. And as an open source maintainer, I've had issues come up that just deeply upset me. And instead of spending the next 2 hours that evening answering issues and reviewing PRs, I'm just kind of fuming inside. I'm upset and I can't get myself back out of that headspace. And I go to bed upset. And you know what? It didn't do anyone any good. I didn't ship any code. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but you know, so important. Let's be nice to each other. Anyway, are we done? Nah, of course not. There's heaps left to do on React Select from here. Working on a hooks rewrite to prepare for concurrent mode. I'm really interested to see how these composition patterns that I showed you evolve once we get to hooks and concurrency. I think they'll change a little bit. I'm not sure how much. I think they'll simplify the logic a bit more, but it's going to be really interesting to see how that evolves. I'm hoping that being able to bring those benefits that the React team's been talking about with hooks to the project will also help make it friendlier for other contributors to come in, because it does make the chunks of logic and code it's dealing with clearer. So you're welcome to contribute if you want to help. If anyone wants to shout out and help me with this, come and have a chat or reach me on Twitter. That'd be great. And final shout out, we are actually working on a design system framework at ThinkMill that's trying to take these principles to a broader set of UI components. And if anyone's working in a similar space, I'd love to talk to you about that as well afterwards. Get in touch with me. And that's it from me. Thank you.